back to the show. This is The Law Show on CL 650.
Hey, and welcome back to the show. You're listening to CL 650. This is The Law Show. Rudolf Kischer and Alex Stojicevic are here from MKS Law in downtown Vancouver. You used to be in Yaletown, and you've moved recently to where?
Yeah, we're down at Granville and Hastings, right next to the Burke's building.
Which is handy for gifts.
But my wife likes to meet me down there sometimes. So recommends I'll pick you up at your office.
Those little blue boxes,
stop.
They're always popular. And a Tiffany box to go with it. All right, so we've been talking about the executive order that Donald Trump passed, I think within the first week or 10 days he was in office, banning travel from certain countries. And it's had a ripple effect for people who are already in the United States. I was reading a story on the CBC about a Somali group. They had been in the United States for a couple of years, and their refugee claim had been denied, but for some sort of technical reason, they were still allowed to be there. Donald Trump came in. They said, okay, listen, time to get out. We're heading north. They didn't go to the border. They just crossed the barrier. They didn't go to a physical border. They just crossed the field into Canada, called the RCMP, called 911, got picked up by the RCMP, and then say, we'd like to claim refugee status. So there's a whole lot going on there. But we're seeing more of these people coming north to the border to try and get out of the United States under the new Trump administration. So what are your thoughts on this?
Well, yeah, I mean, I'll let Rudy start.
Yeah, well, with the ban of the 7 countries, they're not allowed to process visas. So these groups, people that originate or are making a refugee claim from one of the 7 countries that are already in the United States, are fearful either that they're going to get deported, and Trump has also talked about speeding up deportations if people aren't taking, because in sort of failed states, as Alex has talked about, it's almost impossible to deport people. Like from Canada, if you were to be, if you had a deportation order to go back to Somalia, you wouldn't be able to be removed because the country's unsafe, right? It's unclear from Trump's talk.
So is this part of like a UN sort of mandate that if it's an unsafe place, you can't send them back there?
Well, I mean, if someone fails a refugee claim, it's part of it's a Canadian approach that we're not going to send somebody back where there's no country to send them back to. There's no who's going to receive them. There's no functioning government at the airport, etc. There'll be a danger upon arrival, and we also have no relationship almost with that country to arrange that sort of return.
Might not even have an embassy there anymore.
Or an embassy here to get a travel document to let them get on a plane. So there's very few of those countries, and I haven't checked, but I imagine a couple of them are on that list.
No, they are definitely. 4, So I mean, and then the challenge that you have is that we have built into our legislation layers of protection for people like this. There's something, if you have a removal order, there's something called a pre-removal risk assessment, and we sometimes have temporary bans on deportations to certain countries. And so right now there's multiple countries on that list.
So Syria includes some of these,
right? Yeah.
So this Somalia story that I read, they didn't get into the details of why he was still allowed to be in the United States. That's maybe the reason why. They just said out of circumstances, he was in the United States living with family members in Ohio, and then decided to make the trek north because they were thinking, listen, I'm a Somali national living in the United States. Maybe I should be in Canada, maybe a more welcoming atmosphere. And they crossed the border, not at the border crossing, but just crossed the field into...
they entered illegally.
Yeah.
And the mechanics of this are... as a result of an agreement that we have with the United States that's called the Safe Third Country Agreement. The focus of that agreement is essentially on the first safe country you enter into between Canada and the United States. That's where you make a claim. You are not able then to make a claim in the second country if you your application is called.
You don't get a welcome response.
That's right.
Yeah.
However, the irony of that is that that agreement doesn't apply if you enter the country illegally. If you enter the country legally...
So if they had gone to the border where there were border guards...
They would probably not have been let in.
Right.
Because although there's exceptions to the Safe Third Country rule, if you have family in Canada and a few other exceptions, generally speaking... you would not be allowed in because of it. Because you've already made a claim in the United States. And
I'm hearing chatter in the headlines that they maybe want to change that rule.
Well, there's been, I don't think the government has said that. I mean, the Canadian Association of Refugee Lawyers has called for that they should rip up the agreement because it no longer applies. Because the thought process when it was developed, right, is that, well, if the United States has a similar system to ours and you're able to get protection in the
So
United
they're
States,
integrated systems.
they're not integrated, but we're saying you have an
Similar,
opportunity there. You
yeah.
shouldn't be allowed to sort of shop, right? And this is the same thing that they have in Europe. So under the Irish Accord in the European Union, if you arrive from Turkey, let's say, to Greece, as a refugee, you're supposed to make your claim and be processed in Greece. But nobody was enforcing that accord. So what happened is refugees arriving from Syria
going to Germany
would go right through to Germany. Mm-hmm. And that was a large complaint is, well, this shouldn't actually be happening the way the accord was meant to work. So the idea in Canada was, why should we have these people be heard twice? The United States has a reasonable refugee system that you should be processed there. Now that the concern is, after this order, is, well, is it reasonable? If you take a look at this sort of ban, people are calling it a Muslim ban, are they going to get fair treatment? And they're not even allowed to be processed. There's a 90-day bar on them actually being processed, so they're not able to actually make a claim.
Well, this is just one story I read, just one.
Yeah.
And there's dozens of people coming north to the border.
Well, I think it's a testament to the fear that people fear that they're not going to be able to actually, what sort of treatment they're going to receive down there. And I think Canada is going to have to, my guess is may have to respond, because what's happening, as Alex mentioned, that you're treated differently. You're better off actually crossing illegally, right, if you're in danger. I mean, it doesn't mean that this factor won't be considered when you make the hearing, because what likely happen to these people when they're picked up by the RCMP is they're taken to the Canadian Border Services Agency. They're most likely detained. Then they get a detention review within 48 hours, and then they have to decide, do we know who you are you a danger to Canada, and are you a flight risk? If they look at all those three things and they say, well, you're none of those, we're going to let you go until you have your hearing date, right? And then their hearing is supposed to be processed if they're eligible to make a claim. But in this case, they may not be eligible because of they might be eligible to make the claim, but it may be processed fast. And they will look at things, well, you were in the U.S., you claimed in the U.S., why did it fail? And it may be very hard to overcome that. Right?
Well, the thing that's interesting in the story that I read is that whoever dropped this person off knew to not go to the official border and just to cross a field. They said, don't go to the border with border guards, just cross and phone 911.
So you have two tensions here. I mean, you have the tension on the side of Carl and the Refugee Lawyers Association of Canada and other groups such as a group that we're very involved with, the Canadian Bar Association's immigration section, that are very concerned with refugee rights and that the rights of refugees aren't being honored because of bans like the executive order, these blanket kind of bans. And at the same time, though, you have a government that is very concerned with pressure on it to remove the Safe Third Country Agreement, and which is concerned that people that aren't happy with what's going on in the States will simply come up and make refugee claims in Canada. And the challenge that you have...
But wait, I just want to say, it's like with our Prime Minister tweeting out, to those fleeing persecution, terror, and war, Canadians will welcome you, regardless of your faith. Diversity is our strength. Isn't that a telegraph that maybe come to Canada?
Well, it may be, but on the other hand, though, I'm going to remind all your listeners, we had visa-free travel from Mexico for the better part of 24 years until in 2007, 8, and 9, we had tens and tens of thousands of Mexicans making refugee claims, which resulted in us putting a visa restriction on Mexicans that went from 2009 onward. We did the same with Slovakia and Hungary at different times, the Czech Republic. It is one thing to put out rhetoric that you're going to be happy to take in everybody from everywhere. If you're resettling them from overseas, if they start showing up at your border and you have to deal with them under Canadian law, let's understand how woefully ill-equipped we are. We're talking right now, Canada Border Services is spending a fair amount of money on a new detention facility aimed at both illegal migrants and for people that have that are being detained under the Immigration and Refugee Protection Act, which is going to be built in Surrey, which is going to be the first custom facility that they've built in a very, very long time in Western Canada. They're talking about this, and this is a big capital expenditure for them. They're rolling it out for 2018, and there's been broad stakeholder consultation over it, which the various stakeholders are very happy about. But this facility is going to house 60 people, 60 or 70 for the whole Lower Mainland. If you have hundreds of people starting to do what this family did in Winnipeg, you're going to overwhelm the system pretty quickly.
Well, that's what. I was just going to say, when you have the Prime Minister saying, for those fleeing persecution, terror, and war, Canadians will welcome you. Maybe it was a little bit naive to think that.
I don't think he's naive. I think we.
But we're going to have maybe people in the United States who are on the fringes saying, "I got a better shot in Canada."
I think what you have to remember is Canada has a very sort of special circumstance compared to most of the world when it comes to refugees. Australia lives less than a day's boat trip to Indonesia, right? And they have thousands of people showing up monthly, thousands. We had in Canada. Almost 5 years ago, I think the Sun Sea arrived. Sri Lankans arrived on the shores of Canada. I think we had less than 600, I think, in total. And basically, they were all locked up. That was our response
on the ship. Right?
On the ship, right?
Yeah.
So
it was two ships, Ocean Lady and Sun Sea.
Ocean Lady and Sun Sea. So when actually refugees arrive in large numbers, Canada's typical reaction is to lock them up. Right. And we've had so we take a look at, our history and we say, we're very welcoming to refugees. But the reality is we don't have to deal with a lot that we don't select. So it's very easy for us to be generous and say, OK, we're going to select refugees for, 25,000 that the government's going to help. And we're going to select them from overseas camps where they've been vetted, where we've chosen them, where we know where we can orderly settle them, where there's support in the community for them and do that system. It's a nice position to be in. I think if we start to see, such as we've seen now with these Somalis showing up at the border, I think we're going to see Trudeau's going to be in a very hard spot to sort of answer that question. Right?
And especially given the legislation. The legislation dealing with refugees is from the Conservative government's changes in 2013 and 2012. Those changes, the Balanced Refugee Reform Act, mandate that everybody has to have a hearing within 60 days. So if all of a sudden you have several hundred people coming, they have to be accommodated with a hearing in 60 days. For hearings, you need board members, you need interpreters, you need infrastructure.
You need legal counsel.
Yes.
Legal counsel.
Well, this is the thing that I find interesting. I mean, one of the criticisms of Angela Merkel in Germany, when all of the refugees were coming across the Mediterranean, spilling into Greece and then heading up towards Germany, she says, "We'll welcome you. We'll take 1 million."
Yeah,
which was maybe not the right thing to do because it telegraphed to everybody behind, hey, let's go to Germany.
When I worked for the UNHCR...
No, but let me just finish. So if you have a situation where there's people coming up from the U.S. to Canada because they feel they're going to get a better shot here, it might accelerate. And that's your point, Alex, is we're not ready for this.
And not only are we not ready for it, but we have a problem in that there are already tens of thousands of refugee claimants who can't have hearings right now, who have been in Canada for 5 years.
Right.
Now, how's that possible, Alex? You just said that you have to have a hearing in 60 days.
Yeah.
Well, what happened is everybody who was in the system prior to the changes in 2012 and 2013 were left high and dry by the fact that the new law says any new application has to be dealt with in 60 days. So those people have to wait until all of these new people are vetted. So you have the situation, which is not uncommon in Vancouver or Toronto, where you have people who made their refugee claims in 2010 and 2011 who still haven't had them heard. This was the whole problem why we passed the Balanced Refugee Reform Act, was to deal with these people.
In a timely fashion.
And the more newcomers come that make refugee claims, the fewer resources have been allocated to these legacy cases.
I think the reality is the numbers. I don't know how many Somali claims are sitting in the United States that are going to be willing to sort of come across the border, right? I mean, I think the numbers, there's nobody getting in now.
But Alex is saying you only have 60 beds.
Yeah.
It doesn't take long to fill up.
Well, we don't necessarily lock them up. That's the difference.
Hey, we're kind of going a little overtime here. When we come back, I want to get into the meat and potatoes of what you guys do every day, which is dealing with people wanting to come back and forth across the border with the United States who are skilled, looking for work on either side of the border. We'll continue a great conversation about immigration and citizenship with Rudy Kischer and Alex Stojicevic from MKS Law in downtown Vancouver next on CL 650.
There's more of the show still ahead. This is The Law Show on CL 650.